when we were talking about democracy in ancient Athens, a question that especially museum people like myself or art historians like Sheramy Bundrick wonder about is like, how was that democratic government reflected in the artwork and the architecture in the city? And that question is something that Dr. Bundrick will discuss shortly. And Dr. Bundrick will focus particularly on the Parthenon frieze that you may have seen when you were in the museum.
Thank you so much, Branko. It's nice to be here. Luckily, I'm very loud as well, so I think I'm good. Thank you all for coming. I'm especially happy to see some students here on the last day of spring break. Well done for coming to see us today. Branko gave me the brief of democracy and the visual arts, and this turns out to be a very tall order in 10 minutes. So what I opted to do was focus on one particular monument, and that is the Parthenon frieze, because to me, the Parthenon frieze really does encapsulate a lot of the ideals of Athenian democracy. And you might think, well, that's a really odd choice here at TMA, but actually it's not, because when you go upstairs, you will find some references to the Parthenon frieze in the galleries. So for example, on the left here, you have one of the walls of the Athens Birthplace of Democracy exhibition. And the horizontal photograph at the top is actually a group of photographs of the Parthenon West frieze that were given to the museum by Bill Zawadzki. So you can take a look at that. Those same photographs were then blown up as reproductions to provide sort of ambiance in the Life and Death exhibition. So you can see the Parthenon frieze there. And you can also go in the Life and Death exhibit and find a relatively small early 19th century miniature reconstruction of the Parthenon frieze where the figures are teeny tiny, but it's a lovely little copy of the Parthenon frieze. So you can go upstairs and admire the Parthenon frieze right here. Do I have the next one? Thank you. If I were going to talk properly about the Parthenon frieze, it would take longer than 10 minutes. And since I do have some of my students in the room, I can tell you I'm capable of talking for much longer than 10 minutes. But I will hit the high points on the Parthenon today. So what I'm showing you here is a view of the west facade. And I know that a lot of people in this room have been to the Acropolis. And when you come out from the Propylaea, this is the side you see, the west facade. And the frieze that we're talking about is the 525-foot-long frieze that wrapped around the inner building. And today, the originals of that frieze blocks are, of course, quite contentiously divided between the British Museum in London and the Acropolis Museum in Athens, with some exceptions in other places. The Louvre, I think, has one piece. So it's divided up. And what you're seeing, therefore, on the building today are actually casts that are being installed as part of the restoration works. And I'm sure maybe you have opinions both about where the frieze is now and the idea of putting casts up, but we're not going to worry too much about that. I did want to make the point right away before we get started that the way that we are going to be looking at the frieze today and seeing the blocks sort of straight on and in detail is not how you would have seen it in ancient times. It would have been high up on the building. The frieze would also be somewhat difficult to see with the roof on, and be seeing it at an angle. And so you really wouldn't see it in the kind of holistic way that I'm going to talk about. You'd see it in kind of chunks and pieces as you walk by and as you look up. That being said, originally it was painted as well. So keep that in mind, because that actually would have helped a great deal with visibility. Could I have the next one, please? So the diagram that I'm showing you here is exactly that. It's a holistic view of the entire program of the frieze. And the photographs that we have on view here are of the West frieze, which is there to the left. And the majority of the figures on the frieze, as you can see, are riders and chariots. And the procession, the entire thing, it is thought one subject, and it begins down in the lower left here, which is the southwest corner. And then the north and the south sides, the long sides, operate kind of parallel to each other. You can see that once you get over on this end, we've got musicians, elders, animals, things going on. We'll get to that. And then you round the corner and it says women, heroes, gods, Peplos, we'll get to that, etc. That's the east side. That's the front door of the Parthenon. So we're going to make our way through some of this. Now, the reason why, to me, the Parthenon frieze really does bring up democratic ideals is because it is identified by most scholars as depicting the Panathenaic festival. The Great Panathenea happened every 4 years in the summer in honor of Athena, the patron goddess of Athens. And Panathenea means all the Athenians. So it was an occasion for all the Athenians to get together. But there are other people involved as well, but that's basically the idea behind it. And although it is challenging to talk about some of the details on the frieze because of damage and the lost paint, et cetera, it seems pretty clear that what we're seeing on the frieze is this expression of all the Athenians. So that's the theme I'm interested in today, which is the idea of koinonia or community, which I believe is being shown to us on the frieze. Now, it's not the juries, it's not the ostracism, it's not the law courts, it's not all the things that we just heard about that people think about in terms of democracy. And honestly, the Athenian vase painters seem to have thought that would be very boring to show on pots. They just don't do it. And so the Parthenon frieze instead is showing us a religious occasion, a religious ritual where all the Athenians are together. So within that theme, I've picked 3 sub-themes to mention today. If I could have the next one, please. And the first of those is one of my favorite subjects, food. So here we're seeing 2 blocks that are in the Acropolis Museum and the British Museum. I was very ecumenical. And you see that we have animals on each of those. The occasion that we're seeing, the Panathenaic procession, included a sacrifice at the end. And so what you have to imagine is this massive procession beginning outside the city, winding through the city, going up the Acropolis with 100 cows. And then this is a big sacrifice is going to happen, not in front of the Parthenon, but in front of the Erechtheion. The Erechtheion was the temple of Athena Polios, and that's where the altar was. So the actual procession, the real one, would have paralleled the Parthenon and then made a left, and the sacrifice would happen there. Can I have the next slide, please? So here I'm not showing you the Panathenaic sacrifice exactly. I'm showing you just a couple of vases with scenes of sacrifice. And I'm using these to stress the importance of sacrifice in Athenian religion and what it meant. It was an opportunity for the Panathenea, the Athenians, to engage in community with each other and to reinforce their community with the gods as well. So through food, this was accomplished. And so here on these 2 pots, you're seeing the beginning of a ritual there on the left, and then after the ritual there on the right. Lots of details here we could talk about, but I just want to point out here on the right, you can see some cooking going on. At the end of the sacrifice, there would be food cooked for the humans to share, the mortals to share. But there would also be smoke going up to the gods from the part being burned for them. So it was, again, this idea of feasting and reinforcing that community with the gods and with the humans. And the idea behind that was to reinforce that sense of koinonia in the community. And don't be fooled, though, because not everyone could actually take part in a given sacrifice. You had to be part of that particular community to do it. And so in the Panathenea, the male citizens, their families, some medics, but not all could take part. So it did communicate community, but very much with a twist, so to speak. Grab the next one, please. The second theme I wanted to bring up with the Parthenon frieze is the theme of fabric. And I, unfortunately, had to miss Dr. McClure's lecture, but I believe she talked a bit about the peplos of Athena. And here I'm showing you the scene above the door of the Parthenon. So this would be what you would see when you craned your head and sort of looked before you went in. And this scene is usually interpreted, including by me, as referring to the Panathenaic peplos, this garment that was given to Athena, but not to the fancy statue in here, to the old wooden statue in the Erechtheion. And so we see the fabric there. It looks like it's being sort of inspected, about to be folded up, and then given to the new statue. And weaving the peplos was a community effort. Girls and women worked on this together. Its creation, its presentation to the goddess was a series of rituals all in itself. But as a symbol, it was very, very powerful. Could I have the next one, please? And fabric in general was such a powerful symbol for Athenians and for all Greeks. And textiles were not just for sort of clothes for the family, they were a form of currency, they were a form of wealth, they were a means of social networking, even among women. We read about this in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the metaphors of spinning and weaving were applied to all kinds of things, song, dance, and even politics. So for example, in Aristophanes' comedy Lysistrata of 411 BCE, so a little bit after our frieze, while the women are enacting their wartime sex strike and occupying the Acropolis, the title character uses a metaphor related to wool work to express a solution for ending the war with the Spartans. And her idea or her metaphor is to weave a clonies, a cloak or a blanket of all the people. And she speaks not only of the Athenians themselves, but she also mentions, mixing in the way one would mix wool in a wool basket. Medics, anyone who's foreign or friend, or anyone who owes money to the state, which is very interesting. So to my mind, having fabric above the door of the Parthenon in such a prominent place is referring to the literal panenthetic peplos that was woven and was given, that you'd see if you were there in the procession and you would see it being given to the goddess. But it also encodes the intertwined, interwoven community of all the Athenians. So it seems quite meaningful that that is the prominent symbol above the door. There's the next one, please. Oh, let's see. I was supposed to do that. That's fine. Okay, this is good. So lastly, and kind of intertwined with these other things, is the metaphor of family. So I love alliterations. We've got food, we've got fabric, we've got family. Family is very explicit on the Parthenon frieze with the family of the Olympian gods. So there's our peplos scene in the center. And if you look to the left, we have Zeus and Hera. And Hera has her garment open. So there's our fabric theme and a kind of nuptial gesture. To the other end, we have Athena and Hephaestus, but not in our picture, but you'll have to trust me that they were there, are Artemis, Apollo, Poseidon, Aphrodite, even Ares, who is very rare in art, Hermes, they're all there. So the family of Olympians were receiving the procession as it rounded the corner. And so they were all there. But implicit in the frieze as a whole, in my opinion, is this idea of the Athenians as a family. And we were hearing about that from Professor Roberts earlier when she talked about the creation of the tribal system and all of this idea of a family. And that metaphor is very, very powerful in the language of citizenship and the language of belonging. So for example, the term sharing in the city is a phrase that recurs in a number of the court cases and the references to various laws. So the idea of being a family and belonging is very, very powerful. Can I have the next one, please? And as we also heard from Professor Roberts, and it was not planned at all, but I was quite glad to hear her mention autochthony, because as she mentioned, the Athenians believed themselves autochthonous in a couple of different ways. One of those is having always lived in the same place, but also quite literally, and she mentioned this, and now I've got illustrations, that they were born from the earth. Their ancestors were literally born from the earth. And she mentioned the myth of Erichthonius, and I just happen to have a couple of vases here with that story. And if you don't know that story, it's one of the wacky birth stories of Greek mythology, to say the least. Long story short, Hephaestus was pursuing Athena and attempted to assault her on either Attic soil or the Acropolis, depending on your source. And well, how can I put it? He missed, yes. And his semen fell on the ground, and lo and behold, there was a baby because the earth goddess Gaia gave birth. I told you, wacky birth story. And so there is Gaia emerging from the earth here on both these vases, and what she's doing is she's presenting the baby to Athena. And then on the right we have Hephaestus, on the left we have Zeus and a couple of other folks. But this idea of literally being born from the earth and that being something that united the Athenians together was very powerful. And you'll notice a very lovely textile, by the way, on that left-hand slide. Next one, please. So this idea of the family of the Athenians, the koinonia of the Athenians is present on the frieze in this very all-inclusive way. But it's a very curated image. And if we had more time, we'd talk about that in more detail. But it is striking who is here, because we do have girls and women, even though, as we heard, they had no political role to play, they did have very powerful religious roles to play, extremely important ritual roles. So girls and women are prominently shown on the east side, on the main side of the frieze. And with the oikos, the household, being a building block of the polis, this is quite important for women to be here. Similarly, many scholars think that we have some medics on the frieze as well. medics being the resident immigrants who had sort of the resident foreigners. I don't love any of those terms,
Right.
but you get my point. They were not Athenian, but they were living in town. They paid special taxes. There were reasons that they were considered part of the community while simultaneously not part of the community. There are things they couldn't do. But they are alluded to here on the frieze, it seems. So there are medics here as well. Now, it does seem that everyone here is very wealthy and that there is a definite reference here to social class. We have all the wealthy cavalrymen, but we don't have the sailors. We don't have the oarsmen that we were hearing about earlier. They're not here. So not everyone is here, but the idea is that of koinonia. So even if we can kind of pick apart the details here, nonetheless, I think it's clear that that is what the frieze was trying to do, what the designers of the frieze were trying to do, Phidias perhaps, is to give us this idea of community and family through food and fabric, building very much on the things that Professor Roberts brought up earlier. Hopefully that was 10 minutes.
Thank you, Sheramy. So I wanted to pick up a little bit on that and on the question as a museum curator, if you were to have an exhibition that is based in archaeology and ancient art, how would you curate an exhibition that displays the reflections of Athenian democracy in its art? You can't bring the Acropolis. Of course, you can bring photographs of, say, the Parthenon frieze or a skill model, but where else would you find reflections of democracy? The literal democracy happened on the Pnyx, a hillside where the assembly was held, where elections were held. So when here in the museum, we thought about doing an exhibition on this subject, and we chose the 19th century photography collection as the starting point, we don't have a photograph of the Pnyx. So the most important site where democracy happened, we don't have a photograph. There are beautiful models of what at the height in what is called phase 3, what the Pnyx looked like. That would be something that you could borrow or that you can have a second copy made. That is the place. And you can see how, it's a big structure, but it's basically level, slightly stepped. And then this podium that you see here on this photograph is there in the middle. That's where the speakers address the assembly. So a real reflection of this sense of equality, equality. Everyone is standing, listening to the speaker, making their voices heard. And there are other reflections of democracy. Democracy became an abstract concept. And that's what I said to my directors, like an exhibition about democracy, but that's an abstract concept. You can't, well, actually, the Greeks have personification. So you can have what you see here seated is the people, a man being crowned by Demokratia. And that happens to be on a stele or a text, an inscription that was written as a decree by the assembly against tyranny. You remember that Dr. Roberts spoke about the tyranny of the Pisistratids, but the threat of that tyranny coming back, some powerful person taking back power, that was very much in people's mind, particularly when a power like Macedonia became more influential on the scene. And here, part of the text reads, "For the good fortune of the Athenian people, the lawmakers shall decide if anyone rises up against the people for a tyranny or joins in establishing a tyranny or overthrows the Athenian people or the democracy at Athens, whoever kills anyone who does any of those things, they shall be without guilt." You can murder anyone who wants to overthrow the government, but I particularly like how you can overthrow the people, you can overthrow the democracy, and very explicit about it. So the relief scene is right above this inscription. So making very visual this abstract notion of the democracy yeah, almost glorifying the people. Something that every museum curator will tell you, oh, well, you can have ostraka. What are ostraka? Shards with names written on them. Every year, the assembly would have a meeting. Shall we ostracize someone? And if enough votes were counted, then yes, we were going to have an ostracism. The person who would, what is the number? You needed to have a maximum.
6,000.
You needed to get 6,000 people to vote, and then you'd be expelled, banished for 10 years. A particularly powerful way of avoiding tyrants of taking power. If you think that anyone, this Pericles guy, don't trust him, you send them away. And you can recall them, but unless you recall them, they'll be banished for 10 years, and their property is no longer theirs. Pericles was very often found on these shirts. They are found by the thousands. Themistocles, the man who saved Athens from the Persians, he was thrown out. Why? Because people with that kind of power are becoming dangerous, and this is the instrument. So it's not really art, but certainly archaeological artifacts that are found. And you have to imagine that, what is it, maybe 10% of the population is literate enough to write Themistocles or Pericles. So they're little secretaries sitting at the entrance. Which name? Do you want to add something? The idiot? Okay. Of course, citizens are also mostly the soldiers, the foot soldiers, the cavalry, the ship rowers who go into battle to defend the state, whether that is during explicit periods of warfare or the threat of it. Decisions over who is going to go to war, when they are going to go to war, that is directly held in the assembly. It's not a representative who makes that decision. So reflections of how important warfare is, even in times of peace, are illustrations of what it means to be an Athenian citizen. You are there to defend your country. Many of those reflections are like heroic depictions. So here you see warriors or soldiers fighting over a fallen corpse. It doesn't say who it is, but anyone who has read Homer, that could be the battle over the corpse of Patroclus. Because many of these paintings have this kind of heroic quality. And if that is something they paint, then that is no doubt also something that people feel, that as soldiers, they are reliving generations of warfare that goes back to the beginning of time. Of course, Athens also has a city name that honors its goddess, Athena. An image of Athena is also a reflection of what is held important in the city of Athens. Athena gave the olive tree. The olive tree is what made the Athenians rich, what established their power throughout the Eastern Mediterranean with olive oil. Athena is also the goddess of weaving, hence the peplos that becomes so important, and hence a way of honoring the contribution to women in society who weave, who make clothes. And the most important priesthood is held by a woman who leads that procession that Sheramy spoke about. Of course, Athena is also the goddess of military strategy. If you fight warfare a lot, it's maybe helpful to worship a god or goddess who is instructive. Rather than choosing Ares, the god of bloodlust and battle, the Athenians worship their chief city goddess, Athena, who is the military, strategic part of warfare. And one of her most common attributes is to hold the statue of Nike, victory, and you see her floating in the background. This was a beautiful presentation in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. Not sure if it's still up, but a beautiful presentation, very dramatic. And these are some of the ways of how you can look for art and how it reflects the ideals at the time that democracy was born. There are about, I think, 12 objects of ancient art in the exhibition upstairs. If you haven't seen it, or even if you have, I would love to take you upstairs after our panel discussion and have a look at some of these themes. The theater was important. Why? Because that is where playwrights could discuss themes that are part of the popular debate about personal responsibility, the rule of law or justice. Is that something that is divinely given, or is that something that we protect? Education becomes important. I don't mean to be political, but if you want to have a democracy that functions, you need to have citizens who have an education. Flaunting that education at a symposium where you meet with your friends and you have a drink and you show them how well you can quote your Homer or your Euripides, that shows how sophisticated you are. So the symposium too is an important institution in which you show how Athenian you are. So those are some of the ways that you could try and illustrate what ancient Athens at its time of democracy was reflected in its art. With that, I would like to turn the microphone over to Scott. We are taking our panel now into modern times, reflect on a very important ancient historian, meaning a historian of ancient history, Moses Finley, who has been an influence on all of us as scholars. Whether you agree or disagree, you cannot move around him. You have to acknowledge, and Scott will explain why.
Okay, democracy, ancient and modern. The selection of Professor Roberts was inspired, I think, here, because I think, as you've seen, she demonstrates the importance of talking about the modern influences of ancient history. She does this throughout the book. Of course, you can see from the title, which you can also look at here, one out of many, one. Of course, that's part of what she's trying to show there, taking the famous American motto, trying to show that ultimately there are many ways to look at the Greeks. And so she has chapters on sport, on theater, on philosophy, all of them inspiring later generations of people. What do the Greeks have to give us? A few years ago, I was given the task of coming up with a topic for a general education course, and I wanted to do something on democracy. So I wanted to title the course Democracy in World History, not just of ancient Athens, but the entirety of democracy up to the present moment, anywhere in the globe. So I asked Professor Roberts, who was the person I thought knew most about this, what book should I look at to prepare this? She suggested I look at Jeff Miller's book. And I wanted to show you the cover of that book, because I think it illustrates exactly the themes that Professor Roberts so brilliantly put together. These ideas that we tend to think that what we're going through as Americans is something new. And that's something I think historians always want to remind, that the past can give us some new way of looking at current conditions, even though it's from the ancient world. So if you'd move ahead to the next one, the specific title, Democracy, Ancient and Modern, however, has been used before. And I gather that Branko did not select this on purpose, but it just so happens to be the title of a book by Moses Finley, who's considered one of the great ancient historians, certainly of the 20th century, if not in current times as well. What I'd like to do is just tell you a little bit about Moses Finley and this book and its specific context, including the dedication page of the book, and ask you to think about this book in modern times, not only in the 1950s, which is pretty important to this study, but also in 2025, and what we can still learn from a book like this. First of all, a little bit about Moses Finley's background. If you advance the slide, I'll come back to the other thing there. There has been a lot of attention to Moses Finley in the last 12 years. That's because the centenary of his birth occurred in 2012. He was born in New York City in 1912. He graduated from Syracuse University at the age of 15. He went on to become one of the most important and distinguished ancient historians of the modern world. People tend to think he was British because he ended his career in the most important phase of his career from the 1950s through his death in the 1980s, were at the University of Cambridge. And as we'll see, there's a specific reason for that he could not finish out his career in the United States. My advisor at Chapel Hill was a student of Moses Finley at Cambridge. And so in some ways, I'm kind of like a grandson scholar of Moses Finley, who never, in spite of being in Cambridge, never lost his Bronx accent, was a chain smoker. You'll see anytime you see a photograph of Moses Finley, there's usually a cigarette, but he was proud of his American identity. And we'll see the irony of that in a moment. He also, of course, went on to become one of the most important scholars of multiple fields of ancient history. He wrote a classic book on ancient Sicily. He was most famous for his early work on the ancient economy. And this is the most famous book from the early 1970s. He was a lifelong advocate for incorporating social science method and techniques. He was also an advocate for teaching Greek and Latin sources in translation rather than the original languages. He was an authority on several subjects, but he was also influenced by modern philosophical developments. Oftentimes he's described as a Marxist, and yet it would be more appropriate to call him a Weberian, someone who uses social science methods. I did an article on him in 2012. If you go back to the commemoration of Moses Finley led to a lot of events. I was invited to speak at a conference on Moses Finley, and that resulted in a journal publication, a special issue for the American Journal of Philology in 2014. There have been two books, one in 2016, the middle book there, Moses Finley in Politics, or 2013. The final book on the end is 2016. So these conferences led to many publications. I've reviewed both of the two books there in other publications. So he became a kind of an obsession of mine beginning in 2012, and someone I wanted to know more about, not just as a scholar, but what can we learn? I learned, for example, that in the 1930s, he was strongly influenced by the Frankfurt School in exile. As soon as Hitler came to power, he drove out many scholars. Particularly Jewish scholars, but those who were left-wing in their beliefs were driven, and they found exile in New York City. And many of them taught at Columbia, they taught at the New School of Social Research. They were involved in many events right in the city, and they didn't speak English very well. So actually, Moses Finley became the American English translator for many of these scholars in exile. In the process, I argued in my article, he learned techniques that were well known in Europe, but not known at all in the United States, which in terms of ancient scholarship was far, far behind what had been done in Europe for many decades. On the specifics of his biography, I'll just give you a little round number. Usually when you see pictures of Finley, you see him in the 1970s and 80s. But it takes a little digging, but you can actually find images of him at a much earlier stage in his life. He was born in 1912. He graduated from college in 1927. That was actually covered in the local newspaper in New York City. He was the youngest undergraduate ever to graduate, apparently, at least at that time. He married Mary Moskowitz, and she died the day before he did. It was one of the great love relationships, and the day after she died, he died in 1986. He changed his name from Moses Israel Finkelstein to Moses Israel Finley. And I stress that because it's something that my partner, of course, changed his name from Horowitz to Howard in the 1980s. And I think it's always important to remember that for many people, anti-Semitism is as American as anywhere else. And it will make, of course, it made a strong impression on Moses Finley that he realized he could not publish under the name Finkelstein. And probably as early as October, November of 1946, he had changed his name to Finley with an EY rather than an AY. There's been a lot of research on him by Dan Tompkins, who's a scholar at Temple University, who's dug through archives trying to find his early life. But the most important event in his life is probably in the next thing. On the last day of 1952, Moses Finley was fired from his job at Rutgers University. He taught at the Newark campus of Rutgers University. There are 3 campuses to Rutgers, then as now. He was, according to the leading expert, Ellen Schrecker, who is, I brought her book here called No Ivory Tower. She's written quite a lot about Moses Finley because he is, in her judgment, and she's the leading expert on McCarthyism, particularly as it affected academics in the 1950s. He was the first academic to plead the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination before a HUAC committee, for an investigating committee. Rutgers also conducted its own investigation and decided to fire him rather than, and their rationale was because he would not testify and he would not admit to his Communist Party affiliations, which, by the way, he never did admit to. And he probably was a member of the party, but he and his wife were very committed to their beliefs and their causes. And they believed the United States had no right to ask them what their affiliations were. Of course, that's a First Amendment privilege we all have, theoretically. But of course, in the McCarthy era, theoretically became less important as you look at this. So I just want to stress that he was forced to leave the country in 1954. He's floundered for a while. He was on a blacklist. Academics had blacklists, just like the Hollywood screen industry and many other industries at the time. He found his way to Cambridge University in 1955. He was invited to what was called Darwin College, and that's where he remained the rest of his career. And the final irony, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II in 1979 and died as Sir Moses Finley, a former American living in Britain. Just stress that. The reason I want to stress his background is because if we go back a few slides to the book itself, he was asked to come back to Rutgers and give a series of lectures in the 1970s about democracy. Of course, by then he was quite famous. And Rutgers had changed its opinions about some things by then. Just to tell you something that's really quite important, Rutgers University also had a very distinguished American historian among its ranks, a left-wing historian called Eugene Genovese. In the mid-1960s, he was famous for his writings. Former President Nixon and former Vice President Nixon and future President Nixon insisted that Eugene Genovese be fired by Rutgers. But Rutgers stood up to that and decided not to fire him. However, Genovese found himself in Canada, another exile from America, because he felt that the conditions would be more germane to his research and writing. He also said in the 1960s, and this is what really drew Nixon's ire, I don't only hope for a Viet Cong victory in Vietnam, I welcome it. And for his speech, the government tried to fire him. His university decided not to. So by the early 1970s, Finley had come back to a very different institution, or what he thought might be a different institution. He then published the series of 3 lectures in the early 1970s, I have there. He then expanded with new information and some other publications, the book for publication by Rutgers University Press in 1985. So it's a story of redemption and righting wrongs, as well as some other important degrees of history. I want to just give you an overview of chapter 2. I brought all these books with me so I can share them with you, because it's been wonderful to go back to Moses Finley again. After a few years of not reading Finley closely, I was thrilled to do that this time. Chapter 2 is entitled Athenian Demagogues. It was originally published in Past and Present, which was a British, and still is, a British Marxist historian's journal. In 1962, it was expanded for the 2nd edition of Democracy, Ancient and Modern. And what he describes is the different appearances of the word demagogue in Aristophanes, particularly the comic playwright. Actually, it's very interesting. The noun demagogue is never used in antiquity. It's so demagogic. There are adjectival uses and verbal uses, but not the noun demagogue itself. Some of you may have heard a lot about demagogues in the past few years, let's say. But let me just put this in some context. He begins the chapter with stories from Thucydides, Professor Robert's expertise, and to which he's contributed so much, on Sicilian expedition that led to disaster. Cleon, who had to recall the ship that was going to, well, he'd sent a ship to massacre the people of Mytilene, and then the next day, another vote was taken, and they decided to recall the first ship. Luckily, the second ship made it just ahead of the first ship. It's a good example that Thucydides is trying to show you here of how a democracy can make a stupid decision and just get lucky enough to stop itself from doing something it will regret. That's Thucydides' attitude. But what Finley does so brilliantly in the book is to make this argument that ultimately democracy needs demagogues, that the glories of Athens are attributable to the demagogue, to the person who literally leads the people. And his argument, I think, has been not fully appreciated by people who are looking at it now. This is a man, after all, who was the victim of a demagogue in Senator McCarthy. And yet, what is he able to say? That a democracy can change. A democracy can change its mind quickly and make the right decision. But ultimately, if you just don't have anybody leading the people, you will have, and he makes the key point, every leader in Athens was a demagogue, by definition. There were no political parties. There were no affiliations. And again, I think Finley makes a brilliant argument here that if you want to compare Athenian democracy to current British or American democracy, we know what the vote is going to be before it happens. Think of the confirmation votes you've seen lately or the budget votes. We know the vote, how the votes are going to be. So the speeches you're hearing on C-SPAN are all performative. They're not going to change anyone's mind. The whip will tell the people to vote and they will vote in line because that's how it works. In Athens, every vote is up for persuasion. Now that may, of course, there are many limitations to that, as Professor Roberts stressed, in terms of class and education and the ability to actually persuade a group. But notice that every single person has a vote. And there's no electoral college standing in the way of you and your vote. There's nothing moderating, particularly a political party, what you will decide on a given day. And there's a person chosen at random sitting at the front of the room. And I just want to conclude with that. Finley, who realized what democracy could do to someone and how it could destroy someone's career, at least try to destroy someone's career, could also talk about how democracy could lead to glorious change, could lead to that kind of innovation. Something that I imagine Dr. Roberts will come to, and I hope she will. James Madison in the Federalist Papers talked about the dangers of democracy. Again, those of you who study American history will realize there's not really much love for Athens in our founding fathers. And yet, Socrates, the day after Socrates died, there was an attack on his accusers. There were statues put up in his honor in 399 BCE. And part of what Madison said is, the problem with democracy is it's hemlock one day and statues the next. But that's, of course, in the Federalist Papers, which our governor wants me to teach in class. So just to know that. But notice, in some way, what's really interesting here is that the democracy can do abominable things. Every democracy does. But it can do the opposite the next day. And so before we get too negative about democracy, and I'm with you, I'm kind of glad this session happened after the election, in spite of everything. But I think what I take from reading Finley is someone who had hope that democracy could be something worth believing in. And so I would leave to that. Thank you.
So folks, we're running a little short on time, but let's look at this beautiful post from almost 10 years ago. The Greeks still remember when President Barack Obama was in Athens, and he gave a speech that included the following. I'm going to cite this because I think it's worth our while before I turn it over back to Dr. Roberts. Most of all, we, the world, are indebted to Greece for the most precious of gifts, the truth, the understanding that as individuals of free will, we have the right and the capacity to govern ourselves. For it was here, he's in Athens at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, it was here 25 centuries ago in the rocky hills of this city that a new idea emerged. Demokratia, kratos, the power, the right to rule, comes from demos, the people. And then a little further on in the speech, the flame first lit here in Athens never died. It was ultimately nurtured by a great enlightenment. It was fanned by America's founders who declared that we, the people, shall rule, that all men are created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. So that is giving the impression that ancient Athenian democracy lay at the foundation of the creation of the United States and the writing of the US Constitution. So when I invited Dr. Roberts and our other speakers to discuss that influence, Jennifer, what was your response? Ha ha ha.
Thank you very, very much, Branko, and thank you, all of you who made time to come and be with us today. It's just so great to see you and my fellow panelists. At least my university doesn't have the ignominy of having fired Moses Finley. We simply fired Bertrand Russell.
That's right. That's right. Why I'm not a Christian. Yeah.
I'm trying to incorporate as many elements as I can. Sheramy talked about having the important, I wrote this down, food, fabric, and family. So I did have food in my presentation. You'll remember there were Brussels sprouts and burritos, not at the same time, but I also talked about the imaginary family that the Americans believed that they were all descended from. But I didn't get anything in on fabric, but I think, we're talking a little bit about the fabric of government, so I might be okay there. I'm very glad that Sheramy brought in the dubious circumstances of the birth of Erichthonius by the, fathered by the attempted rapist Hephaestus. The Athenians were so proud of their heritage. They were descended from an attempted rapist, and then their first king, Theseus, was actually a very accomplished serial rapist. So it's understandable the Athenians took such pride in their heritage. But if we look across the Atlantic at the men who set about framing a government for the new American nation late in the 18th century, we'll discover that actually the founders discovered in Athens primarily an anti-model. So when I found out from Branko's email that I was coming to tell you about how the founders, they liked Athens, I was sort of, reminded of the story of St. Paul, who was coming to Damascus to persecute the Christians. And the authorities in Damascus say, well, there's some good news and some bad news. The good news is that the guy who was coming to persecute the Christians has arrived. The bad news is he converted on the trip. So, the expert on Athenian democracy has arrived. Unfortunately, she's not here to tell us how much the founders liked it. It's very interesting because where did the founders learn about Athenian democracy? Well, it came, of course, partly from their reading in ancient Greek texts. And the most popular ancient writer in the entire 18th century was Plutarch. And Plutarch, in his biographies that are translated into English as the Parallel Lives, made very clear that he did not like democracy at all. So they weren't going to get any positive vibes from Plutarch. But also, Plutarch had been read very widely in Europe, with the result that the European texts that the Americans were reading didn't think too well of democracy either. Already in 1679, which is back in the 17th century, Hobbes, in his autobiography, reported that Thucydides' contempt for democratic government had made him his favorite author. And Montesquieu, whose writings were quoted by the founders more often than any other work than the Bible, he actually liked Athens quite a bit. But what the founders took from his work was predominantly his emphasis on the separation of powers, something that the founders were very warm about because it was the opposite of monarchy. And separation of powers was very much lacking in Athens. The writings of John Adams made very clear that Adams had a large amount of enthusiasm, very small amount of democracy. He said if there was one lesson that leapt from the pages of history, it was the necessity for a separation of powers. And he was convinced that an Athenian-style government, and this is a very interesting development. He was very worried that the Athenian-style government would violate the most sacred principle of the human community, which is the sanctity of private property. Now, never mind that I wouldn't really identify the sanctity of private property as the most sacred principle of the human community. This was an extraordinary idea since the Athenians never for 1 minute violated the sanctity of private property. I was talking to you about the lawgiver Solon, who had divided the Athenians into those 4 classes. A lot of the poor were hoping and the rich were fearing that he would redistribute property. He didn't redistribute property. It never even occurred to him to redistribute property. So Adams writes, the moment that the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, anarchy and tyranny commence. But the Athenians never violated the sanctity of private property. Now in France, people were also reading Plutarch. Plutarch was incredibly popular during the French Revolution because there were all those martyred heroes in Plutarch. And the schoolmaster Charles Rollin in 1729 published a very influential history of the ancient world. And it was touted for its value in improving young minds. Well, how was it supposed to improve young minds? Well, it would teach them that fickleness and inconstancy were the prevailing characteristic of the Athenians. Well, John Adams was a very big admirer of Rollin, and in fact, in attacking Athenian democracy, he quoted from Rollin's history in a single sentence that stood as a whole paragraph. Is this government or the waves of the sea? And the founders thought that Athenian democracy was mob rule, and James Madison mentioned that of whatever characters composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. And he insisted that even if every Athenian citizen had been a Socrates, nonetheless, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob. Well, there were exceptions. There are always exceptions. Tom Paine in 1792 proclaimed that what Athens was in miniature, America will be in magnitude. But not too many people shared his views, and the eventual collapse of all the ancient states was frequently held against them. And among the classical republics, it was really Athens that gave the most offense. Madison complained, as Scott was mentioning before, of the turbulence of democracy. And John Adams saw in popular sovereignty this terrible threat to the sanctity of property. Well, the move away from monarchy had made a lot of people nervous. But as time went by and it began to look as if this daring experiment in self-government, in non-monarchic government in the United States might actually work, people began speaking warmly about democracy. Wordsworth wrote to his friend William Matthews, "I am of that odious class of men called Democrats." And on this side of the Atlantic, Thomas Jefferson announced in 1816 that we in America are self-consciously Democrats. In England, there was a lot of stuff happening. The reform bills and the growth of utilitarianism sparked new attitudes to Athenian democracy. And this reached its climax with George Grote's multi-volume history of Greece that came out in 10 volumes between 1846 and 1856. And after that, democracy acquired the charge that it still has today, where it's what is known as a virtue word. You say democracy and you're supposed to feel all warm and fuzzy. So democracy is now up there with sunset and ice cream and warm puppy. But it was an uphill struggle to get here. So I'm very glad that we're all here today talking about democracy and talking about some of the many people over the centuries who have wrestled with the question of what democracy is all about and whether it's a good thing and how it can best be used in a positive way. And I think it's a very timely discussion. So I'm very pleased to have been able to share these ideas with my colleagues and with you.
Thank you.